We should be going live here in a second. Let's see, setting up your meeting for Facebook Live.
Yeah, it says live on Facebook, so we're waiting for it to actually go live.
Good.
All right.
Facebook Live.
Yeah, it says live on Facebook, so we're
We're
good to actually go live. All right. Thank you, Phil.
Yep.
All right, sorry about the delay. Definitely had some technical difficulties there. I've only hosted 3 of these myself, and I'm pretty sure 2 of them I've failed to actually get to go live on time. But we're here. I'm very happy about tonight. I want to welcome everybody to our ERW Rev War Revelry. I am Billy Griffith here representing us tonight, and I am joined by historian and author John Maass. Most recently, he has published the book, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, The Most Desperate Engagement, a really good book highlighting the Southern campaign, as well as focusing on Nathaniel Greene and Charles Cornwallis's winter campaign of 1780, 1781. So before I go into that, I want to give you a little introduction into who John is. Right now, he's an education staff member of the new National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir. He's received his PhD in early American history at The Ohio State University, and he's the author of several books, including the one I've just shown you, and numerous articles on U.S. military history, including North Carolina in the French and Indian War in 2013, Defending a New Nation in 2013 as well, The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson Lafayette and the British Invasion of Virginia, a very good book focusing on the kind of the road leading up to Yorktown, just as the title implies. That was in 2015, and then George Washington's Virginia in 2017. So again, I want to thank you very much, John, for being with us here tonight as we discuss your book. But before we do go into the subject matter, in these author interviews, I really like to kind of ask the author a little bit about their experience, what drew them to writing this book. So going through your biography there, a lot of your Rev War books do focus on the war in the Southern theater, which is usually the theater that always gets neglected and ignored in place of the Northern theater. So why the interest in there? And then what really inspired you to write about Guilford Courthouse?
Well, I think you're right about the South traditionally getting the short end of the stick on coverage, especially in overall books about the Revolution. You'd almost always see Boston and the Northern battles, Saratoga, and then chapter after chapter on Northern events, and then at the very end, there's one chapter that takes the whole South from Great Bridge to Yorktown. Fortunately, I think that's a thing of the past, and I think there's been, I don't know, you and the audience tonight probably would also have an opinion on this, but I think there's been a real resurgence in books about the South and the Revolution, both generals, battles, campaigns, probably for the last, maybe even going back to John Buchanan's book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, and then, which I believe was 97, if I'm not mistaken. There's been a lot more that's come out. Even Rick Atkinson has now turned to the Revolution. It'll be interesting to see how he handles a lot of the Southern campaign. I mainly got interested in the South and the Revolution because of living in Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. Since 1977, I've only not lived in the South for a 5-year period, which means there's a lot of area to cover that hasn't been covered yet. I think with the publication of Greene's papers and with Ian Saberton's collection of Cornwallis's papers, it's a lot easier to do that kind of research. So. And my dissertation at Ohio State was also on the Revolution in North Carolina. And the reason I chose it was there's a lot of records out there if you knew where to look for them, and not a lot written. So it's always good to have a topic that hasn't been written on when you're trying to write in graduate school. So that's probably why I was drawn most to the South.
And how about tackling this actual book project for Guilford on its own?
Well, I used to live in Winston-Salem for about 4 years, so I was close to the battle. I went over there quite frequently. I wasn't really working in the history business, so to speak, but one of my advisors in grad school said the best way to learn about a topic is to write about it. So that when you start and you make assumptions and you realize, well, this book says one thing and that book says something else. And I like to write books for myself and for the audience. So I want the book to be something that if I was in the gift shop or the bookstore at Guilford Courthouse or Yorktown, I would say, oh, wow, that looks like something interesting. So I wanted to learn the details of the battle and to try to tell it in my own way.
And one thing I do like about your book is how you do really draw in the historiography of the topic as well. It isn't just the primary sources. You are in your text, you're either agreeing or disagreeing a lot of the times with modern day historians and their assessments on it. But talking about primary sources, that's the hardest thing. And like you mentioned, it's more so about where to find them, not, what they are when you do find them. But as an historian, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when gathering Red War sources and then in turn kind of ripping them apart and interpreting them?
Well, for people who have been reading and writing and studying the Revolutionary War for a long time, it seems like they tend to use this, or I'm sorry, some books tend to use the same sources over and over again that others have. I remember hearing somebody make a comment about the fact that Joseph Plum Martin seems to have been at every battle in the Revolutionary War and then some. And he's mentioned over and over again. But to try to get more of the common soldier voice, now that's much, much easier for the Civil War and beyond, Civil War through today. Getting first person primary, either diaries, letters, that's especially for an enlisted man. But you can find them, and the easiest way that most folks know about who do writing on the Revolutionary War is to use the pension applications. And so those are online for the most part. And I went to a site that had transcribed a lot of the Southern Campaign Revolutionary War pension applications that had been filed in I guess it was the 1820s and 30s, I think. I could be wrong on that. And with keyword searches with Guilford or Greene, other commanders' names, I was able to find probably 60 or 70 pension applications that of veterans who had fought at Guilford Courthouse and who actually had meaningful things to say. Because not all the pension applications say, the unit, my regiment marched here, then we fought the British there, and my cousin was killed next to me at the battle, and that's why I remember it. And a lot of them are just, I served from this time to this time, then I was mustered out, the end. But about over 50, I'd say 60 to 70 applications were detailed enough and helpful enough on things like the weather and the retreat and the roads and how many shots they fired. That was another, things like that. So that is really a good place to go. And the other source I use, it's when I was writing my dissertation, it was not online. It was the Colonial and State Records of North Carolina, and that came out in the 1880s. And they're magnificent. They even have a 4-volume index, which is great. But since I finished at Ohio State in 2007, they have been digitized and put on the UNC library website under Documenting the American South collection, and they're searchable, and you can read them in order. You can read them by author, by time, by date. And so that's another great source for anybody who's working in the South, because it's not just about North Carolina. There's a lot of South Carolina material in there too.
And you're talking about those pension records and the things that these soldiers remember when they do file, and it's obviously the things that they're proud of or the things that they're miserable about.
Mhm.
like as we'll be talking about tonight during this winter of 1780, 1781, the weather, and also the lack of supplies, especially on the American side. And then when it comes to the militia, maybe militiamen wanting to be remembered that they fired shots and stood their ground, fired away, and did not just drop their weapons and run.
Mhm.
So now we're actually going to get into the subject matter of this book. And your book does begin in 1780. Well, actually, before 1780, you kind of give a synopsis of the Southern theater up to that point. Kind of all roads have to begin somewhere. So you put us right at the beginning of the road to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So for maybe some people who aren't really fluent in the Southern theater before 1780, 1781, kind of paint a picture of the situation in the South up to the fall of Charleston, South Carolina.
Well, the British started in 1776 with Clinton's campaign at Cape Fear to try to support loyalists in North Carolina very early in the war. That led to, or he arrived too late to help. The Battle of Moores Creek Bridge had already been fought. The British then, under Clinton, General Sir Henry Clinton, then went down to Charleston. They were rebuffed in June, I believe it was June 28th, 1776 at Fort Moultrie. And after that, there wasn't a lot of very active campaigning in the South. There was some minor militia skirmishes and a 1776 campaign against the Cherokees from North Carolina. But toward the end of December of 1778, the British had a renewed focus on the South. They captured Savannah. They attempted to capture Charleston, South Carolina. So there was a renewed focus. They were trying to tap into what they considered to be a wealth of loyalist support. And they assumed that the loyalists were going to come out and in droves, armed, ready to go and help out. Some did, most didn't. But the British had some success in the South right up until the spring of 1780. And because of that success, Clinton, Sir Henry Clinton, who was the commander-in-chief of British forces in 1778 and to the end of the war, the British decided to refocus on the South. And of course, as you mentioned, there was a major campaign, a tremendous amphibious campaign that launched from New York in February of 1780, landed below Charleston, South Carolina, and was able to capture Charleston, which surrendered on May 12, 1780, with basically almost the entire Continental Army Corps in the South, and a lot of militia, artillery, supplies. It was a very devastating surrender of American forces. I believe, it was really, it had the potential for really being the knockout blow to the war had things gone differently.
Right. And so after that, Charleston falls. Cornwallis is going to remain in the South, as Clinton will take the bulk of his army that he had down there with him back to New York City, but he'll leave Cornwallis in essentially overall command of the Southern armies there. And this is really Cornwallis's chance to get away from Clinton. You know that he doesn't have a good relationship with Henry Clinton, and it's his chance to have his own independent command, and at some points, even go behind Clinton's back to kind of execute his own personal ideas of campaigns that he might have. But so going forward now, what is Britain's military strategy in the South, at least when it comes to South Carolina and North Carolina? What's their main objective?
Mm-hmm. So it's often referred to in books as the Southern strategy. That may be too vague, or maybe that's too general, and that's debatable. But what they were trying to do is conquer and occupy, or at least subdue, a large section of the South. Now, part of the reason they decided to refocus on the South was because they were being told by loyalists in the Carolinas and Georgia, and also loyalists who had gone to Britain, that there was a tremendous amount of support for the crown in the South, and that if the British made an attempt to defeat American forces there, and also to really subdue the patriots by making them turn in their arms, pledging loyalty oaths that they would not fight again and that they were loyal to the crown, that then the South could be reoccupied, and the so-called rebels, the patriots, would be knocked out of the war. There was also by 1780, at the latest, a diplomatic possibility that that the war would end between the French, the British, Americans, possibly be negotiated by either Russia or another European entity, where the fighting would end in the situation where the British and Americans and the French would keep what territory they had at the time of the peace, the diplomatic peace settlement. So the more that the British occupied, when they eventually got to the peace table, the more that they would get to keep. And now it's not certain, and that's not a lot of things had to happen before that could have taken place. As we now know, it did not take place, but there was this notion that that's what was going to happen. There was also the wealth of South Carolina that the British wanted to get back, a harbor in Charleston that would allow them to refit and resupply, because by this time the French and the British, they were mainly facing off in the West Indies, and the British wanted some kind of port or base to be able to support those efforts. So capturing South Carolina, that was the goal of the Charleston campaign. And then once Clinton went back to New York about a month later, 6 weeks later or so, and left Cornwallis, Cornwallis's job was to secure South Carolina. And when he decided that he was going to move into North Carolina, that really wasn't Clinton's plan. And as you mentioned, they did not get along very well. They were barely on speaking terms, really. And Cornwallis was not a good correspondent with Clinton all through the Southern campaign.
And Cornwallis himself, too, at the time, is trying to urge Clinton to open up another front in the Chesapeake as well. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. In fact, that's what they had. What he eventually did is go to Virginia, to the Chesapeake. There had been a few campaigns, naval and infantry campaigns earlier. The Matthew Collier's raid in the Portsmouth, Norfolk area. There was some. General Leslie was there in 1780 and eventually came to North Carolina to reinforce Cornwallis. But he wanted the Chesapeake campaign to be a diversion so that Virginia would focus its resources on defending itself and not send resources down to the Carolinas. That was his main objective, was to open a Chesapeake front, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now we'll jump down back to South Carolina and kind of focus a little bit on the Americans. Everybody knows about the disaster at Camden and how the Southern Army's almost annihilated. And it's amazing that it continues to exist after that. And that does show a large part, I think, to Gates, which he doesn't get a lot of credit for,
right,
and kind of keeping the Army in place until Greene comes there. Right. But following that defeat, what is the American situation in the South now? Can you describe that briefly?
Well, there were some troops still left after Camden. A lot of the militia went home, never to be seen again. Some of them, when they were recaptured, both in North Carolina and Virginia, as a penalty for running, they were actually made to serve in Continental units for 18 months. But Gates tried to regroup at Hillsborough, North Carolina, and was somewhat successful. The supply situation was horrible. Very few supplies coming in from anywhere other than the basics for food, but weapons were in very short supply. Uniforms had been really worn out. Cavalry was almost impossible to mount. By late September, Gates started moving a lot of his troops to different places in the state because it was too difficult to feed them when they were all together, because basically supplies were basically hand to mouth at that point. And Greene suffered from that too for quite a while too. There were few depots, and Gates, correct. If you read Gates's correspondence after the Battle of Camden, he was urging state leaders to try to get depots to bring in food, bring in beef on the hoof, but it was very difficult to supply them and keep them together, and they were in pretty bad shape by the time Greene showed up.
Okay, so in your book, now we'll jump ahead a little bit to October of 1780 when Greene is appointed. You describe his appointment to command of the Southern Army as essentially a turning point or a critical moment in its own right of the entire war. What did Greene himself bring to the table, and why was he the perfect man to help rebuild this army?
Well, he was uniquely qualified in a way because this war in the South was going to be won with logistics. They had to have a way to try to turn around the horrible supply problem, to get more men in uniform, with arms, with equipment, trained by competent officers, enlisted for more than 2 or 3 months. They had to have boats to cross rivers, aid in the transportation, and Greene was the former quartermaster of the Army when he served with Washington in the Northern Theater. He had a lot of experience with bringing order and organization to the quartermaster department up north. He had worked in business in Rhode Island. His family had an iron foundry and made iron products, most notably ship anchors, and they traded all up and down the east coasts of the colonies. So he knew how to run a business and to keep on top of supplies, and that which was something was badly needed there. I think too, Greene had a lot of experience by 1780, October 1780, when he was appointed to the position. He had fought at Trenton, Monmouth Courthouse, Brandywine, and Germantown. He was really an experienced commander, which turned out to be a prophetic choice. And you'll probably remember that when Gates was appointed the commander in the South after the fall of Charleston, Congress did that against Washington's wishes. In fact, they did not even give Washington a choice. Well, it took the debacle at Camden to prove to Congress that, hey, maybe we ought to consult with George Washington on this. He probably knows who the best general officer would be to take over, and he had no doubt about who that was going to be. And in Greene's correspondence, his published correspondence, you can see that it was no surprise to him that he was going to get that position. And in the letters to delegates of the Continental Congress, you can see also that the Southern congressmen in Georgia and South Carolina were lobbying Congress for Greene.
And up to that point in the war, it's definitely very difficult to find a bad day during the conflict that Greene actually had, albeit Fort Washington, and giving Washington that suggestion to hold it. But yeah, no, he definitely was like a man who was made for that position. And that's why I totally agree with you when you say it was a turning point or critical moment in
Mhm.
not just the Southern campaign, but the war itself when he
Mhm.
takes command. So with Greene's army, who were some of the key players that will be by his side for the next several months until Guilford?
Well, one of the things that also made it very interesting and important when Greene was appointed was that Washington allowed him to bring down the Lee's Legion, commanded by Light Horse Harry Lee. Lee wasn't in as big a hurry to get down south as he could have been, but eventually arrived. He proved to be, he was very young, and Greene had two cavalry commanders, one of which was Lee, the other one was William Washington. And those two, especially in the Guilford campaign and the race to the Dan, they really stuck with Greene. They were invaluable. They both commanded mounted units. Greene also brought with him another major general, Baron von Steuben, who most people know of as the drill master of Valley Forge. And Greene was actually going to put him in command of troops in the South. But by the time they got to the Richmond and Petersburg area, Greene and Steuben figured out that it was going to take a person of authority in Virginia to gather supplies, weapons, recruit troops, get them ready to send down to the Carolinas to fight. And Greene decided to leave Steuben up in Virginia to marshal those forces because he was a Continental Major General who would be able to tell Virginia militia commanders and logisticians and supply officers, here's what we need, here's where we needed to go, and get it there immediately. So Greene also, by the time he got to his camp at Charlotte, December 2nd, 1780, probably one of his most important, if not the most important officer he found there was Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan had a long experience in the Revolution, had left the army, excuse me, I believe in 1778, and over a dispute of the appointment to be the commander of Washington's light infantry. So he went home to the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley and really had not much of a role up until the British invasion of the Carolinas. And Morgan decided, well, I'm going to put my dispute behind me and join Gates' army. And when he was promoted to be a brigadier general, most folks know that he was the American commander at Cowpens. He was actually not at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Illness and his physical condition finally made him kind of have to leave the army somewhere, I believe, at the end of February, middle to end of February. So there were some other militia commanders there too. William Davidson, some folks know, is a North Carolina militia figure. William R. Davie became one of Greene's logistical officers. So he did have some talented folks there in the South. Andrew Pickens, for a long time, led the Virginia militia between Cowpens and almost to Guilford Courthouse. But some names folks might recognize.
And one person in the chat mentioned how William Campbell too will end up being Greene.
Campbell came within a few weeks of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Initially, Campbell had reported to Greene, Gates, and then Greene that he would be able to bring 1,000 riflemen from what Jefferson called the rifle counties, which were all the backcountry counties of Virginia from Augusta and Rockbridge down into what's now Southwest Virginia, but also Bedford, Pennsylvania. But for reasons probably we don't have time to delve into here, but he only arrived with 60 men. So Greene was very disappointed, but those those riflemen were very important for the flanks on the first line at the battle.
Yeah, so despite what happens at Cowpens, as you mentioned, an American victory there, and also Kings Mountain too, several months before that, Cornwallis is going to end up getting his invasion of North Carolina anyway. So to jump ahead real quick, let's briefly describe to me, what is the race to the Dan that everybody always talks about, and what is its significance?
Well, its significance can't be overplayed, but that hasn't stopped historians in the past from over dramatizing it. A recent book, I can't remember the author's name, but it's called To the End of the World. It was just published last year by Westholm, I believe. Excellent book. It's the best book I've read on the campaign and race to the Dan. What happened was Cornwallis needed to lighten up his troops because they had too much baggage and they were not able to catch up with the American troops under Greene after Cowpens. So at a place called Ramser's Mill, which is on the west side of the Catawba River, the Catawba runs in that area runs north to south by Charlotte. A lot of it is now part of Lake Norman in North Carolina. So Cornwallis decided that he was going to burn his baggage, and a lot of the baggage, other than some wagons for ammunition, medicine, and the wounded, was burned. The officers' baggage, some of the superfluous equipment, camp equipment, even the rum was burned or poured on the ground. And he needed to catch up with Greene. Now, Greene was on the other side of the river, having rejoined Morgan's force with his main army, which had been over in Cheraw, South Carolina, on the PD River, which in North Carolina is called the Yadkin River. Greene recognized that he had to get away from Cornwallis, that Cornwallis had been reinforced with about 12 to 1,500 men from General Leslie's command that came from the Chesapeake. So Greene collected his forces at Guilford Courthouse in early February. And on about February 9th, he decided that they were going to retreat into Virginia and to try to keep a river barrier between himself and Cornwallis. Lafayette did the same thing in Virginia in June of 1781 for the same reasons, actually. So Cornwallis started after Greene, but due to the floodwaters in the Yadkin, just east of Salisbury, North Carolina, the British couldn't catch Greene at Guilford Courthouse. So they started marching a little bit north and went through the Moravian settlements near today's Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And Greene decided to play a little trick on Cornwallis by creating a light contingent of his own, commanded by Colonel Otho Holland Williams of the Maryland Line, which would consist of some of the Maryland troops, the Delaware contingent, some riflemen, and William Washington and Light Horse Harry Lee's cavalry troops. And what he was going to do is fool Cornwallis into where he was going to cross the Dan. Directly north of Guilford area, near today's Danville, Virginia, there was a crossing of the Dan called Dix's Ferry. And Cornwallis believed that Greene would cross there because it was narrower and it wouldn't be as wide and flooded as it would be farther downstream. So Greene sent this light contingent under Colonel Williams to make contact with Cornwallis near Salem and start retreating toward Dix's Ferry, as if that was the rear guard of the whole army that was heading toward Dix's Ferry. And Cornwallis took the bait. And meanwhile, Greene, instead of going directly north, went northeast to two of the lower fords and ferries called Boyd's Ferry and Irwin's Ferry. And previously he had some of his logistical officers gather as many boats as possible along the river, upstream and downstream, and collect them at those two ferries for just this purpose. So you had the British following the decoy and Greene heading toward the real crossing points. And Boyd's Ferry, for those of you who know Virginia geography, Boyd's Ferry is at modern South Boston, Virginia, in Halifax County. So the British chased the Americans, and some of Williams' writings and Light Horse Harry Lee's writings would say that sometimes the head of the British contingent was within a musket shot of the rear of the Americans. They could see each other's fires at night. It was cold, it was rainy. The men slept every other day. Food was scarce, but eventually Williams went back to the road that Greene was on to follow him. It was very, very close run thing. In fact, on the 11th or 12th of February, which is only 2 days before Greene reached Boyd's Ferry, Williams was warning him, "You better cross, because I don't know that I can save you, and I don't know that I can even save my own force, even if I can save yours." But in the end, Cornwallis and his men were not able to keep up, and the Americans crossed the Dan River about 8 or 10 hours before the British troops arrived on February 14th.
So after the Americans now cross, what does Cornwallis do?
Well, the British got to the river, and Greene had started to put up defenses near the ferries and the forts, because eventually the water was going to go down, right? But Cornwallis, they had marched, remember, from Winnsboro, South Carolina, to Charlotte, to the Catawba, all through central North Carolina. Now they were just across the North Carolina line in Virginia. These men were exhausted, broken down, shoeless, and so he brought his men to Hillsborough, which is south of South Boston, which was in essence, other than Salisbury, it was probably the largest town in the backcountry, and he expected support there from loyalists that didn't show up, and supplies which were very difficult to gather. And Greene followed him about 2 days later.
Okay, and there's kind of even another turning point in this campaign now is how I think it's March 10th, all of a sudden some reinforcements start arriving for Greene, and that's going to change his whole strategy of how he's going to handle Cornwallis. Right.
So by about March 10th and through the actual evening before the battle was fought March 15th, even through the night of the 14th, reinforcements were coming in. So he received a contingent of Continentals who had been forwarded from Virginia, a new regiment from Maryland, the new 2nd Maryland, some Virginians, a lot of North Carolina militia were finally able to be raised and brought from a lot of the eastern counties of the state, coming into Greene's camp, and also contingents of Virginia militia under Edward Stevens, who had fought at the Battle of Camden and saw his militia really run for the rear at the first shot. So he was reinforced. His army got up to about 4,400 men. And by about the 11th or 12th of March, he realized that his critical mass, meaning the time when he was going to have the most number of troops, which he would probably never have that many again, which he was correct, now was the time for the battle. Now, the point I make in my book is that you'll remember that the army had gathered at Guilford Courthouse February 9th prior to heading for the Dan. And I can't tell you how many books, articles, columns, blogs, websites will say that Greene picked out Guilford Courthouse as the place to have a battle, and everything else led up to that as a choreographed dance, and even to the point where an obliging Cornwallis attacked Greene at Guilford Courthouse, and that it was a four-run thing, a foreordained location for a battle. Now, Greene, of course, as an experienced commander, not to mention supported by his engineers, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, other officers, they recognized that the crossroads was an important location. They could bring troops to Guilford Courthouse. They could have an easy access of escape if need be. They could be resupplied. It was wooded and open, but enough wood so that British bayonet charges were not necessarily going to do the same thing they did at Camden. So many historians regard Greene moving to Guilford Courthouse on the night of the 14th and camping there waiting for the British to come and attack. That is not true. And the correspondence of a number of participants on the British and American side, including Greene, Light Horse Harry Lee, St. George Tucker of the Virginia forces, some of the other folks who wrote back later to Jefferson. There's some British reports that talk about it. Greene, all these documents note that Greene was on the offensive on the 14th, and he was moving to attack the British, who were to the southwest of him at a place called Deep Creek Meeting House. It was a Quaker meeting house located close to what's now High Point in Jamestown, North Carolina. And so the reason why he did not attack Cornwallis but was moving toward attacking was that at 3 a.m. on the 15th, Cornwallis's army began to stir, and the American cavalry scouts reported back to Greene that the British were moving, and that they were moving back on Greene's position at Guilford Courthouse. So once Greene learned that Cornwallis had taken the offensive first on the morning of the 15th, that's when he deployed his troops into his lines and waited for the British advance.
Okay, so you mentioned those lines that he's going to deploy his men, and he's really taken a play out of the playbook for Daniel Morgan at Cowpens, utilizing what he thinks and that they thought is the militia in their best capacity in a defense in depth. So kind of briefly describe that deployment that his men are going to take up.
So the militia had performed poorly at Camden. They were usually of limited reliability in a stand-up, knockdown battle. Many of them had indifferent equipment. Many had no bayonets. So rather than expect too much from the militia, Greene decided to play to their strengths. So in his first line, which the battlefield was bisected by the New Garden Road, which in other parts of North Carolina is called the Old Salisbury Road, but in this area they called it the New Garden Road. And the first line consisted of North Carolina militia at a fence line, and on their flanks, Greene put in the more experienced troops to kind of prevent flanking and putting those experienced troops in the woods to be able to fire at the advancing British across the field. Those were William Washington's troopers, Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion, some of Campbell's riflemen. There was a company of Delaware troops, Continentals. They were on the right flank with Washington. A few hundred yards behind them, in a wooded area, he posted the Virginia militia. Now, the Virginia militia, a lot of them had actually served in Continental units before or had been on lengthy campaigns as militiamen. So they were a little bit more reliable than the North Carolinians. And then behind them, several hundred yards near the courthouse, at the intersection of the New Garden Road and the Reedy Creek Fork Road, which went directly north from the courthouse at a T intersection, he placed on a ridge his 4 regiment of Continentals, 2 Maryland regiments, 2 Virginia regiments. So this is what we would later call a defense in depth. And the front 2 lines with North Carolina and Virginia militia were really there to blunt the British attack, try to bloody their nose a little bit before eventually they would come to the 3rd line, where the Continentals had been waiting. They had been fed. So that was the strategy that he adopted based on Morgan's deployment at Cowpens in January.
Now, on the other end, Cornwallis's army is pretty greatly outnumbered, but they do have the cream of the crop, essentially. When you come talk about the British army, a bunch of elite troops. You have regular line regiments like the 33rd Foot and the 23rd Foot, as well as the Foot Guards, as Hessians, Dragoons under Tarleton. But describe now, what is those British troops? What is their fate when this battle finally begins?
Well, Cornwallis also deployed on both sides of the road, and I believe probably because he thought that that the militia that he saw in front of him would really break pretty quickly, like Camden. Cornwallis instituted a straight ahead attack, not a lot of finesse, and advanced against the North Carolinians. The Carolinians on the flanks and the Continentals on the flanks of the first line, they did very well. In fact, they caused some casualties. One of the artillery officers was killed right at the beginning of the battle by a long rifle shot. There were Highlanders too that were in the British Army at this point, 2 battalions of the 71st, that at least those that had survived Cowpens. And the British basically broke the first line. The North Carolinians took off. Greene, in his post-battle correspondence to various commanders, was bitter about how they had one of the best positions that should have been a dream for defense, and yet they took off. That's overstating it quite a bit, but there were quite a lot of Carolinians who either didn't fire a shot or fired 1 shot and then left. So after the first line, the British moved to the second line, which was a much tougher stand by the Virginians. It was in the woods. There was a lot of brush, so the British really couldn't make these broad, sweeping bayonet charges. It was not good cavalry country in that part of the battlefield, and the Cornwallis was almost captured because of the smoke and the mist and the light drizzle in that fighting, where the black powder smoke was really held close to the field due to the moisture. Eventually, the Virginians moved off, but they moved off in pretty good order. But they had stayed quite a while in terms of a Revolutionary War battle. Some of the at least 1 or 2 of the Virginians later wrote letters or in their pension applications, they noted that they had fired over 20 rounds. And for a Revolutionary War battle where the British are coming at you with bayonets, you've got to have some pretty good officers and some pretty experienced men and some terrain that's adequate for defense to get off 20 rounds in one part of the battle. Now, because the British were advancing on both sides of the road, they were spread out to the left and the right. Depending on the amount of resistance they faced, they got to the edge of the ravine across which they would have to go to get up to the high ground against the American Continentals. But they got there at different times. So on the left, the 33rd Regiment of the British troops, they got there first, but their attack against the Virginians was unsuccessful. So the American right flank was attacked. The regiments on the right were attacked first. Other units started to come up, including there were 2 battalions of guards, British guards, and the 2nd Guards had come up just to the right of the road, and they saw the courthouse and they saw the 2nd Maryland and a few pieces of American artillery, and they went after it. In fact, Cornwallis later wrote they went after that position with too much enthusiasm, and they overran the Marylanders. The Marylanders broke. They were mostly routed. The British kept pursuing them toward the courthouse and captured the cannons. So Greene's left was broken at this point. However, we don't need to go into the tactics blow by blow, but the 1st Maryland performed very well, and the 1st Maryland was probably the best American regiment on the field that day, and probably in the course of the war, probably the best regiment that the Americans had in the South. And they tangled up with the Guards. Colonel William Washington's cavalry made a sweeping charge from behind their own lines around the left flank and smashed into the Guards basically by surprise. And it was very desperate fighting in there. But at some point, Greene was not a gambler. And at some point at this time, he learned that the Maryland regiment on the left had been routed and didn't necessarily know about the status of other troops in his army. And he decided, well, with 1 regiment routed, we've bloodied them, we've given a good show. Discretion is the better part of valor. And he decided at that point to begin a retreat. And the retreat was an orderly retreat. Everyone knew, and everyone knew that the rally point was the Speedwell Ironworks, several miles northwest of the battlefield on Troublesome Creek. And it's interesting when you read the pension applications, a lot of them all say we made it back to the ironworks or made it to Speedwell, and they all knew where to go. So it was an orderly retreat. Tarleton and the cavalryman with his dragoons and some foot soldiers of the 23rd, they pursued Greene, but when they got to the Reedy Fork, they reached a bridge where the Americans had taken the planks up and also posted one of the Virginia Continental regiments to defend that point. And Tarleton decided that he would not be able to pursue as he had after Cowpens and Waxhaws and places like that. So the battle was over. Greene's men were in pretty good order, although most of the militia started to go home right away. And the British went back to the courthouse area. And in 18th century military custom and tradition, the force that holds the battlefield won the battle. So even though Cornwallis did not destroy Greene's army, he held the field. But as the day went on, it became rainy and darker. The British realized, especially by the next morning, that they had lost about 25% casualties. And the losses among the officers in killed and wounded was very significant as well. So the battle could be said to have been a Pyrrhic victory. The British were a long way from resupply and had not been resupplied since they had left Camden, South Carolina, months beforehand. So it really was a dearly bought victory for the British.
Yeah, so essentially took the wind out of all of Cornwallis's offensive capabilities. Now, since we're approached 8 o'clock now, we're going to start to wrap this up. I do have one question I want to ask you about the battle that I'm sure a lot of our viewers, who we've had a large number tonight, which is incredible, they're probably wondering is during that fight, did Cornwallis order his artillery to fire on his own men?
He did not. He did not. That story comes way, way after the battle. There is nothing in the contemporary documentation that ever happened. I believe Light Horse Harry Lee had a role in perpetuating that myth, but if you read Babbitt's and Howard's book, Long, Obstinate, and Bloody, I mean, they do a tremendous job dissecting that myth, and are absolutely correct that that did not happen.
All right, thank you for that. You mentioned that word obstinate. Reading your book, all the quotes you use from Green, he seems to use it in every other line.
Yes,
Definitely one of his favorite words. All right, well, thank you, John. Is there anything more you'd like to add?
No, I appreciate all the folks who tuned in, so to speak. If maybe there's a way to contact me, Billy, that they could go through you all if anybody has any further questions, or I'd also be happy to, if anybody wants to get a signed copy of the book, just contact me, through Billy, and I'd be happy to work out the details with you.
Again, if you missed what we were discussing earlier, we're talking about John's newest book, which came out last year, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Most Desperate Engagement, published by the History Press. Great book on the Southern campaign and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Definitely recommend that you pick it up. So for now, tune in tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. for Emerging Revolutionary War live videos coming to you from the spot of George Washington's birth, exactly 289 years to the hour. And also some other reminders, our second annual symposium in Alexandria, Virginia, Hindsight is 2020, Revisiting Misconceptions of the Revolution, is coming up on May 22nd. So you can visit our Facebook event page or website for details. And then this November, the 12th through 14th, we are hosting our first bus tour. It will cover the 10 crucial days and will be led by ERW's own Mark Malloy. And again, you can find out info on that on our Facebook, as well as the website as well. So thank you, John, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.